Thank you, CRG, for inviting me. So I am going to read out, and I will be about 41 minutes. What I'm going to present, called City Fiction, Cities in Fiction, is part of something I've been thinking about for a couple of years now in different forms of fiction. So I'm going to begin my talk with a disclaimer. What is the disclaimer? The disclaimer is by talking about city fictions, I do not mean fictional cities. For example, I do not mean the El Dorado, the mythical city of gold, believed in by European voyagers on their way to the Americas, crafted and consolidated retellings. I also do not mean the rich underwater ideal commonwealth of the Atlantis, recorded by Plato in two of his dialogues, as well as remarked upon by a host of medieval European writers following perhaps Arab legends. Closer home, that is in India, I also most definitely do not mean something like R.K. Narayan's Malgudi, based on the real sleepy city town of Mysore, but created through reiterations of its important landmarks, including the school and the river, the streets and the statues, the market and the same people. When I planned this talk, I've been developing this for the last 6.5 months. I also intended to show the opening credits of the highly successful television series from the 90s called Malgudi Days, which takes the drawings by R.K. Lakshman and the novels by R.K. Narayan to create, once again, with cinematic language, with sets and studio, location, color, and sound, a place. So an imaginary place becomes true first in language and then in cinema. But that is something we are not going to explore today. It is interesting to think about the ways in which an imaginary space takes shape from detailed descriptions or the absence of it. The confluence of classes, gender, mobility and immobility, light, gaze, shadow that make its contours concrete. That is for another day. But today I want to concentrate more. Actually, I want to concentrate entirely on a phrase from our concept note. That is, the dominant stories that cities tell of themselves. I will not come back to this phrase again, but that is what I want to talk about. Half of the title of my talk is borrowed from the online archival project, Cities in Fiction, a database of literary landscapes. This is a website which collates real-world locations in literature, encouraging users, contributors to think through fiction as method. The archivists who have undertaken this project out of passion have also kept it crowdsourced. So people, that is readers, users, me and you, are encouraged to contribute their own entries to the list and to mention the specific real-world city that this fiction is set in. My slide is a screenshot of their website in which the real-world cities mentioned in fiction are also plotted onto a world map. With as of now, okay, last year they had 120 entries. The map was still heavily marked by South Asian cities. So what do I mean when I say cities in fiction as an offshoot of something that I've been thinking about for a couple of years now, largely to be termed fiction as method, but I've been trying to think of this through fiction like novel that I will be talking about now, but also fiction as in cinema, which is also something I've been dealing with for a little while. I think fiction as method necessitates looking beyond fiction and literature of any kind as mere repository of information, mere reflection of the time and the conditions within which it was produced. Fiction also renders actual spaces imaginatively, which is what we are going to talk about. It adds meaning, signification. It represents, recreates, symbolizes, and constructs. So our task is not the same as that of the historians who looks at literature of a specific period to identify modes of thought and fashion, references to experiences, landmarks, events. Basically, we are not merely looking at fiction as historical archive. Neither are we looking at it from the perspective of the biographer. So I'm not trying to tie up events in history or the author's personal history into specific works of fiction in themes, concerns, motives, and characters. So what am I trying to do? And we have already been introduced to this by Professor Hartnick. So in fact, one of the most important cultural theorists of modernity and urbanity, Raymond Williams, in The Country and the City, draws almost entirely on literature, from the nostalgic ruminations of a retreating village landscape, the confining of pastures into private landholdings, to the city, the symbol of capitalist production, which altered men's relationship with other men and with things. But it is also about ways of talking about the country and the city, the literary genres that are made and unmade here, from pastorals to more urban forms. So when I'm trying to read cities in fiction as both embodying the history of space and place, I'm also hoping to think about eventually the histories of empire and nation, people and population via the arsenals of a literature's craft. So fiction becomes the sites and objects, cities are both the sites and objects of representation. The relationship between city and fiction, especially modern narrative fiction, is organic. In realism and fantasy, in the representations of the metropolis in Indian cinema, which is part of this exciting collection, City Flicks, which is on the right-hand side, Madhav Prasad argues that the city by nature is capable of containing, without loss of credibility, an infinity of fictional characters and events. That is because the city is experienced as a space inhabited by populations whose number can be counted more or less accurately, but whose mutual relationship cannot be easily specified. So in a little while, we shall move into a bit more concrete examples, all of which can coexist without any lapse in credibility. So let me repeat this. So city without loss of credibility can contain an infinity of fictional characters and events. They don't need to intersect with each other by virtue of what the city is imagined as. Madhav Prasad further claims, I quote, modern fiction, whether as novel or narrative film, has a congenital intimacy with the urban. It is this urban in narrative fiction that holds interest to us. I have been watching the Netflix series, The Lincoln Lawyer, based on a bunch of novels by Michael Connelly. This is a series about the cases fought by a recovering addict lawyer and his crew and family as he zooms around the city of Los Angeles between downtown and the LA River, Mulholland Drive, and Malibu. Let's take a look at this really remarkable bit of the opening credits in which a map of Los Angeles turns into the title of the show. I am looking at this sequence as the most apt introduction to what I'm going to talk about today. We all know Los Angeles. I have not been there. I do not know whether you have been there. But we know Los Angeles. We know the Hollywood sign. We know the names of important studios and localities, from Bel Air to Malibu, from beach houses to Pasadena, from Hollywood Boulevard to the Walk of Fame. And more often than not, we know this from works of fiction in literature and in cinema and in television. Now, for Los Angeles, I know Bel Air because as a child, I watched The Fresh Prince of Bel Air. I know Malibu because as an adult, I watched Two and a Half Men. And I know Pasadena because even older adult, I watched The Big Bang Theory. But before I, or indeed any of us, lived and breathed moving images through social media and multiple other channels, we also learned of Los Angeles, or at least those of us like me, who are emotionally and otherwise invested in the noir crime fiction, that is a dark crime fiction, from the master of the genre himself. So Raymond Chandler of The Big Sleep and various other Philip Marlowe novels. Now, this is a map of Chandler's Los Angeles in which real places are identified with their fictional recreations. And There are multiple sightseeing tours that take one to the city as Chandler drew it, landmarks important to the fictional characters. This is not the only such instance. There are multiple plans online to curate the best Kurt Wallander walk. If one finds herself in the city of Ystad in Sweden's southern coast, tracing the footsteps of police inspector Kurt Wallander, now also the subject of multiple television series. This is a Google Map screenshot. So what you see on the map is Kurt Wallander's house, but of course there was nobody called Kurt Wallander. So what they did was, when the old police station at Mariagatan fell empty, when the police station moved elsewhere, they named it Kurt Wallander's house, and that is how now it also appears on the map. So Kurt Wallander was originally created by author Henning Mankell, but something similar has happened to Sherlock Holmes. The fictional address of 221B on the very real Baker Street now boasts of a blue plaque of the Holmes Museum accepting mail addressed to Sherlock Holmes, declaring it to be the residence of the consulting detective. Now, how does fiction create a space into a place? Where does the real of Baker Street mesh into the fictional of 221B? It's not surprising that much of the research on cities in fiction concentrates on the genre of detective fiction because of two possible reasons. That the many volumes that exist which deal with cities and crime point out, number one, being able to move undetected on city streets for both the criminal and the detective, away from close-knit rural communities, cities make multiple identities possible. Crimes are more plausible in the urban setting, where boundaries are blurred, authority and corruption exist together. Cities are constantly in flux with new populations, constructions, interests, flows, regimes, rules, rackets. The second is that the city is inherently criminogenic. We can discuss this, but that seems to be the common sense in a lot of crime fiction. That is, the urban space regularly creates crime. A lot of Nordic fiction, I am going to refer to them. I've been referring to them for some time. They are my favorite genre. I live and breathe them. In Nordic crime fiction, the city as inherently criminogenic, that is, the city breeds crime. So I have shared the cover of The Laughing Policeman, which is a Martin Beck police mystery set in 1960s, 70s by this couple, Choval and Walu, and what they are looking at crime as a result of the retreat of the welfare state, the close collusion of government and police with organized crime, the unsanitary living conditions, the stark difference between yet cohabitation of rich and poor, all of which contribute to urban crime. Most major cities in the world have crime fiction set in them. They have fiction set in them, but they also have crime fiction set in them. In fact, the capital crime fiction set in important European capital cities like Stockholm, Paris, Copenhagen. So Martin Beck is set in Stockholm, Paris and Copenhagen, Amsterdam, extremely disturbing books. Dublin, Belfast, London lend authenticity to crime narratives. The author becomes the literary cartographer, tracing the detective's footsteps in the city along with the criminals on a journey across the city, where the city will yield its secret while the crime gets unraveled. Much crime fiction is serial in nature. The crimes do not necessarily repeat themselves, but characters do. So take Calcutta's two of Calcutta's most iconic crime fighters. Just take Feluda. So the detective novels of Satyajit Ray, Feluda, Topshi, and Lalmohon Babu remain the same. Their address stays the same. They buy their snacks from the same shop in New Market. They still go to Shidhu Jata's house along the same route, but the crime changes. Sometimes fringe characters revisit, sometimes a bumbling police officer, as in Holmes or in Byomkesh. But the city does not remain static. It changes, moves often from vagueness to precision. So when we are talking about the city in crime fiction, we also find how differing from the writer, but at times even in the same writer. And here I have in mind Ian Rankin's Inspector John Rebus novels. So the city moves from being a backdrop to the central character. So between 1987 and 2007, John Rebus paints Edinburgh very, very differently. From being a backdrop to the crimes committed, the city becomes concrete through description and repetition. Sometimes, think about Dan Brown's 2000 novel, Angels and Demons, in which the mysteries of the Vatican City create a foundational crisis in the Roman Catholic Church. And you have to uncover the mystery of the city in order to solve the crisis. Most major American cities have their hard-boiled detectives whose gaze into the mean streets of the cities enable the readers a certain kind of voyeurism by proxy. In the 21st century, although, this gaze is now broken up. The city emerges more as a regulated and surveilled space between CCTV footage and biometric determination of mobility, but also a site of bewilderment with flashing neon signs after the pandemic, a result of older, forgotten zoning practices. Now, Kolkata has its own fiction. Between Hutum Pechar Noksha to the bevy of old Calcutta publications flooding College Street in Bangla and also flooding Amazon, as well as in English, the city of Calcutta, in the age of phone cameras and one-click shares on social media platforms, is created anew in its fictions and fables. I would request you to remember the word fables. Between they show on the screen, we have two iconic songs of Calcutta. On the left, you have a 1992 film called Rokto something, I think Rokte Lekha, which has a important heroine, now also a politician, Debashri Roy, singing Ami Kolkata Rashogolla. So who am I? I am the official sweet of Calcutta. I am Rashogolla, and she's dancing on the streets. But important to remember, she's not dancing on Calcutta streets. She's dancing on the streets of some city in Maharashtra. But she's singing important landmarks of the city. So she recites, as it were, the important places of Calcutta that you can go to. So she says, you can go from Baliganj to Taliganj, Sham Bazar to Bagh Bazar, Beg Bagan to Hati Bagan, Khidirpur, Bhawanipur, Park Street, College Street, VIP and Bypass. So although the song is not set in Calcutta, through the invocation of concrete spaces, it creates a certain kind of Calcutta, while it is also inviting the viewer to take part in the body of this beautiful woman who's dancing, who is sweet and to be devoured like a Rashogolla. But from that, if you move on to 2016, very important, very popular song, Tumio Hete Dekho Kolkata, although they don't really walk much on Kolkata, they walk a little in the film Prakton. This will not make sense to many of you who do not know Bangla, but what is important is they don't talk about the landmarks anymore. They are not saying the names of the places that Debashri Roy is saying. But what are they doing instead? With the change in technology, especially with the use of the drone camera, they are showing us the landmarks. Just to watch it for a while. আলোতে মাখামাখি আমার কখনো নেমে আসে অচেনা প্যারাশুট তোমাকে ভালোবেসে আমার চিরকুট তুমি হেঁটে থাকো কলকাতা তুমি হেঁটে থাকো কলকাতা যাবে কি না যাবে আমার সাথে so it's asking you to it's asking you to walk the streets of Calcutta, right? And it's showing you what are the places you can see if you walk the streets of Calcutta. In the remaining 10 minutes, 10 minutes or so, I want to take a close-ish look at two recent English language crime novels set in Calcutta and what they have to say about the city's public spaces vis-a-vis gender. We will remember the flaneur. Of course, all of us as doing urban studies, we know the flaneur. The protagonist strolls through the city and reflects on it. An idea that comes to us from Balzac via Baudelaire and finally Benjamin. A character which becomes possible only in the great Western metropolitan cities, because in smaller rural towns and suburban spaces, the flaneur would arouse suspicion and curiosity. While in cities like Paris, he can be unobserved and look at the pageantry of the city. So the city displays itself like a pageant in front of the flaneur. He can look at its new scientific inventions and its displays with ambivalent attitude. When I say he, I am of course referring to the flaneur as a gendered figure, which many later feminist scholars of urbanity have flagged. The flaneur is a man of pleasure, but definitely, if not a man of pleasure, definitely of leisure. The city detective, especially the late 19th century, early 20th century European detective, think Sherlock Holmes or closer home, again in Calcutta, think about Byomkesh Bokshi or Feluda. One who observes is a flaneur, subjecting the city to his vertical male gaze. The fleeting impersonal contact in the public spaces of the city are almost always devoid of women, giving rise to the recognition of the invisible flaneur of Elizabeth Watson and the recognition by Janet Wolfe that modernity breeds or makes visible a number of female city dwellers, the prostitute, the widow, the old lady, the lesbian. I'll come back to these, especially two of these categories, the prostitute and the lesbian. And finally, of central concern to us, the murder victim. These last two, the lesbian and the murder victim, find us an entry into the two novels that we are going to look at, who occupies the gendered city and how. A Death in Shonagachi is a 2021 mystery, maybe not so much a crime thriller, a novel by Rijula Das. It is the story of a sex worker, Lali, and her monthly client, Tilu Shao. Tilu visits Lali once a month in the Blue Lotus, a labyrinthine mansion in Shonagachi, ruled over by Shonali Madam. I don't need to talk about Shonagachi because last week Pauladi talked at length about sex workers in Calcutta and the spaces they inhabit and their also organizations. Tilu is the author of, so Lali's monthly customer, Tilu, is the author of slim Bengali pornographic novels featuring an imaginary sister-in-law. But he's actually a lover of Calcutta. He's immersed in its history and its glorious past. He's trying to write an epic about the mythical founder of Calcutta, Job Charnock, the adventurer who was battling tigers and thugs alike. Now, Mohamaya, another sex worker, a more expensive sex worker who lives in Lali's building, is killed brutally, which prompts Shonali Madam to recruit Lali in her place. Lali and an Uzbek sex worker, Sonia, end up in the heart of an epic religious racket of extortion, trafficking, and sexual violence, with multiple repeated encounters with conniving cops, well-meaning South Calcutta NGO workers, and the Shonagachi reeling from the after effects of the demonetization in 2016. The Pan Macmillan website, Pan Macmillan is the novel's US publishers, describe the primary location of the book as, so this is the description of A Death in Shonagachi in the Pan Macmillan website, set in Calcutta's most fabled neighborhood. We had kept fable in our mind. A fable is a fictional narrative, one we are all familiar with in its infinite variations, depending on the culture we come from or we are familiar with. What does it mean to call a neighborhood fabled? Does it mean that there are many stories about this neighborhood? That stories are created in the neighborhood? Or what I think it should mean, and is what I'm trying to do here, that it is impossible to reach that neighborhood without and beyond the stories of the neighborhood. The stories make the place. Remember the tales that cities tell of themselves. Shohini Ghosh's 2002 documentary on the sex workers collective, Durbar Mohila Samanway Committee, Poladi had talked about it in the previous lecture. And even very soon you will be able to hear Poladi's lecture, which she delivered also last week at our City Lights lecture series So you will have greater familiarity with how Sonagachi and the Durbar Mohila Samanway Committee worked. Uh, Also uses the trope of story. So the Tales of the Night Fairies, again, when Shohini Ghosh is making a film on the sex workers of Shonagachi, she is using the trope of stories, tales to chronicle the lives and struggles of sex workers in Shonagachi. In the novel, Death in Shonagachi, the Durbar Mohila Samanway Committee or DMSC is thinly veiled as the women's cooperative in the novel. It is constantly at odds with the story that the police, the government, and the media and some sections of the civil society want to paint up about them. Stories of victimhood, of insignificant lives, and unimportant deaths. In contrast, the women sex workers themselves want to tell stories of friendship, courage, resilience, community building, and love. In some ways, this is also a novel about resisting confinement into stereotypes in easily segregated boxes, and most crucially for our distinction today, this is resisting geographical segregation. Now we know of Shonagachi, we know of it as Kolkata's centuries-old red light district. Some commentators also think of the history of Calcutta as a history of its sex work and sex workers. So we listened to Poladi's lecture yesterday, but you can also watch a short film which is easily available on the Nazaria Third Eye portal called The Sex Work and the City, also by Paramita Chakraborty, and CRG's own film, City of Transit, also refers to how migrant sex workers moving from the docks is also creating a city in a certain way. The sex workers travels from docks to segregated, identified, and we might argue governable segments of space creates the city in a new way. But this is what the novel has to say. Normal people reflected Rambo. Who is Rambo? Rambo is a character in the film in the novel who works as a pimp. Normal people reflected Rambo, if they thought about it at all, thought of the city as having designated red light areas. And these were the well-known whore pits that normal people avoided, denied, visited, or went on a dare to. But for someone like him, the entire city was something that happened between whore pits, which were indeed more numerous and proliferating than those normal people knew or suspected. Whores go everywhere. It was something Sonia had said to him, "My dear Rambo, whores go everywhere." In the public and private division of the 19th century megapolis, of which Calcutta is surely one, where do the sex workers reside? If the city street is not the space for women, what happens to the street worker, the sex worker, a prostitute, a hooker, whore, who solicits on the street? Where does she go? In Death in Shonagachi, the sex workers are the most mobile. Trafficked from her home, from her small village of Kalipur in Purulia, Lali lives and works from Shonagachi. Eventually, she travels to Park Street, which is at the center of the city, also one of the most posh areas, then to the outskirts of the city near Diamond Harbor, and finally to Tilu's home to discover the city on her own terms, like Tilu has been. So the sex worker challenges the neat demarcation of city spaces, gendering the city through her travels and her work. It is interesting to note that Rambo's realization that whores can go everywhere happens on Park Street, the same street which in 2012 was the site of Suzette Jordan's rape and the refusal of Calcutta police, and this is a real life incident for people who do not know it, refusal of the Calcutta police as well as the government to acknowledge the violence and assault that had indeed taken place. Now, this is real life. In the novel, Inspector Bose, a character in A Death in Shonagachi, considers this event to be central to much of his troubles. We didn't want to take the FIR at first, naturally. Some Anglo-Indian chick came to a nightclub and got into a car with some men, and now she says it's rape. Who will believe her? You know what the local MP said? She said that it was a misunderstanding between a lady and her client. Two things here. Number one, A Death in Shonagachi uses the real instance of Suzette Jordan to signify how the police are always reluctant to recognize, let alone register, offenses against sex workers as they do in the novel. But two, the posh location of Park Street with its eateries and lights become a space of danger, of menace. This exact space and this exact incident connects a death in Sonagachi with The Hunter of Lal Bazar, a 2022 thriller by historian and former journalist Shuhit Sen, and perhaps one of the very few police procedurals being written in India right now. In The Hunter of Lal Bazar, the Joint Commissioner of Police, Tanya Samanto, investigates a hooch-induced death in the slums adjoining Baghajotin to find out that her own colleague, Clayton Garcia, has been running a crime empire right under their proverbial noses. Garcia is hunted to Bangladesh, from where he disappears, only to reappear as a taxi driver come rapist who preys on women traveling Calcutta streets late at night. Suzette Jordan is once again invoked in this novel when hospitality worker Gloria is escorted to a taxi after she leaves Park Street, a Park Street bar. So in Sonagachi, we don't know the victim of the rape, the survivor of the rape. In Hunter of Lal Bazar, the victim of the rape, the survivor of the rape, is an actual character. A Death in Sonagachi deals with 3 or 4 Calcutta locations. The Hunter of Lal Bazar, many more. The chapters are divided by location, as you can see on the left. Also, these are also where the rapes and the violence takes place. Incidentally, see, Salt Lake, where CRG is situated, is referred to as Greater Calcutta. But apart from that, the author situates the violence in different parts of the city, in different neighborhoods, residential, commercial, colony. The manhunt details different locations, the police stations, the taxi stands, the bus routes, the cafes, and the roads. This is a novel completely immersed in real locations of Calcutta, played out mostly on its streets and public spaces. Pavements, buses, taxis, libraries, parks, bus stops, colleges, hotels, tea shops, train stations, restaurants, pawn shops, slums. So much so that one wonders, would this novel have been possible in another city? About the serial rapist, Clayton Garcia, JCP Tanya Samanto comments, there won't be any point for him to do what he's doing in Patna or Lucknow or Muzaffarpur for that matter. This could indeed be a comment about the plot and the novel itself. This plot cannot happen in any city other than in Calcutta. Now, I would remind you that I am reading these novels again. When I read them for the first time, it was last year in July, and I'm reading this again. But in the middle, August 9, 2024 has happened. A young woman doctor has been brutally raped and murdered in her workspace, the RG Kar Medical College and Hospital. But also important for what I am saying today is we have been, as a means of protest, occupying the public spaces at all hours. And my concern with public spaces is now also inflected by my experience of having occupied them as a means of protest. There are 2 final points that I shall make, after which I shall stop. Now, these public spaces that we talked about, that these are the list of police stations, Ama Street, Muchipara, Fulbagan, Shiti, but they're also going to the bus stops, the taxi stands, the street side tea shop, the slum areas, the colleges, the parks, etc. Now, who's public and who's public space? The victims and survivors of Clayton's attacks are all women. Gloria, a recovering alcoholic and single mother who was getting a drink in the Park Street bar Sugarloaf, trying to take a taxi back. Aparna Dash, a single mother and insurance agent who was coming home to Santoshpur from her relative's house in Beleghata when the bus broke down and she took a taxi. Out-of-town researcher Chitra, who was walking back to Ramakrishna Mission guest house after having dinner with a fellow library user, and she took a taxi. Software worker who was getting a taxi from Salt Lake to go out for dinner with her boyfriend. And finally, a young college student who defeats and scars this rapist, Ghazala, who was going home to Baliganj Place from College Street after training in martial arts and visiting a friend, also taking a taxi. Now, each of these assaults are termed crimes of opportunity. They were at the wrong place in the wrong time. Familiar streets and neighborhoods after night become unfamiliar for the women in the novel. The safety of public transport, which we know is an elusive safety, retreats in the taxi cab. Does this take us back to the earlier discussions about who occupies the city street? How is it possible to be a woman and also a flaneur? Whether the streets of the metropolis at night is at all safe and a viable space for women. Remember Baudelaire's formulation, the flaneur observes the street walker, the prostitute, one who is sexually available, one whose body is a commodity to be purchased like many other delights of the urban metropolis. Like Suzette Jordan in real life, Gloria is also dismissed by the cops. They consider her complaint to be a deal gone sour, a sex worker's quarrel with her client. Former cop, now rapist Garcia, Clayton Garcia, considers women's bodies to be there for the picking. He thinks of gruesome ways in which he will rape and murder Ghazala and Tanya when he catches them. With the threat of the hunter of Lal Bazar on the prowl, the city streets empty sooner than before. Women try to stop venturing out after dark. Baudelaire's flaneur had encountered yet another character, the lesbian, the manly, masculine woman who, wearing androgynous clothing, could navigate the streets of Paris. There were real-life corollaries to such people. We've already, I think I've mentioned, if I haven't, I'm sorry, George Sand, whose name I cannot pronounce in French, the mid-19th century author, more famous than Victor Hugo and Balzac during her lifetime, who strolled the city of Paris dressed as a boy, writing under a male pseudonym. If we agree that gender is performative, then in The Hunter of Lal Bazar, only two women who are not victims, perform their gender differently. Tanya, by being the boss of several male police officers and by keeping herself fit through practicing combat and martial arts, reckons she will be a good match for the serial rapist. She can shoot at a target very well and fears no man. So although a woman, the way she performs her superiority over other men is very masculine in nature. Ghazala, the one who defeats Garcia twice, regularly runs and jogs, rides a bicycle to her gym, learns how to fight with a knife and carries one on the small of her back, knows judo and is a national champion on her weight category, and finally learns how to shoot a gun. The novel describes her repeatedly as a fighting machine. So to be able to occupy the city streets safely, you have to be one of these two. And this is my basically final argument that in Death in Shonagachi, the whole world, the entire city is a red light district, because not only can women who work as sex workers travel to any place to work, but also a woman being out in the street is likely to be solicited for or is often falling prey to sexual violence. And secondly, who are the only women who can navigate this safely in this narrative universe? I'm not saying this is real life, but this is a narrative universe which uses the city of Calcutta to give it verisimilitude. And in this narrative universe, these are women who perform, quote unquote, as men. At first glance, the sexual politics of both Death in Shonagachi and Hunter of Lal Bazar are all right. They call out personal and institutionalized misogyny. They decry sexual violence. They call for recognition of sex work as work and advocate the right to the city for everyone. But the city, in narrative imagination, continues to be segregated by gender, literally and metaphorically volatile when the neat boundaries of private and public are breached. Cities in fiction, then, even when dealing with real cities and locations, imaginatively render the sexual politics and political economy of the city textually. And although no matter how radical and how liberal in their outlook, these two instances from the recent past seem to be recreating the gendering of the city as a space which is necessarily violent for women occupying them. So uncovering the textual politics of city fictions is central to thinking of cities in fiction and of city fictions. That is all. Thank you.